Okay, good evening and welcome to everybody. Welcome to our regulars. Welcome also to our first timers this week. Nice to have you with us. My name is Alan Freedman. I'm Vice President of the Australian Jewish Association, and I am again your MC for this evening. Also visible on your screens are David Adler, President of the AJA, as well as our guest for tonight, Elkan Levy, who we will introduce formally in a moment. And next to him, if you've got your screen set up, is Andy, who is his partner, and we'll also be hearing from her a little bit later. Tonight's topic is an interesting one. It's all about the Balfour Declaration, and I'm very much looking forward to that. What we're going to do tonight is have a presentation by Elkan for about 30 minutes, and then we will open up for questions from the audience. And as I usually remind people, the way to catch our attention is to click on the raise hand icon so that you're raising your hand electronically. If you go to the participants icon at the bottom and click on that, there should be a raise hand. We get a little message and then I'll put you in the list for questions. The chat function is available, and as usual, I do ask everybody to keep the discussion on the chat to the night's topic. And that way it's better for everybody. Just before we introduce our guest, David, I think we've got a very short video to show people.
Yes, the sound on the video is a bit soft, so you might want to turn your sound up to hear it. This is a special message from the Australian ambassador to Israel. You should see him on your screen now. And let's hear what he has got to say.
Hi everyone, this is Paul Griffiths, the Australian Ambassador to Israel, welcoming you to the New South Wales Australian Jewish Association's talk with Elkan Levy on the Balfour Declaration. As I read into this job, of course, the Balfour Declaration was crucial to read and understand. Its impact is still with us today. In particular, its language on Jewish Zionist aspirations, on national home for the Jewish people, but also that nothing shall be done that may prejudice non-Jewish communities here. It's still with us, it still has an impact, and it's still that impact is still felt in the work that we do every day here. I think it's going to be a great discussion today by a fascinating speaker, and I really hope you enjoy it.
Well, that was very nice.
Very nice.
So that was the Australian ambassador to Israel, and I'll let people know that thanks to Andy, we're trying to organise a session with him. So I think it would be fascinating to find out what his work is all about and just pick his brains a little bit. But on to tonight, I want to tell you about our speaker. Elkan Levy was educated in London, Israel and New York, and has filled a number of communal offices in British Jewry, including President of the United Synagogue, which is actually a union of 62 congregations in Britain. He's been a minister of both Belmont and Radlett synagogues in northwest London and Minister for Small Communities. He chaired the committee that produced the latest edition of the Singer's Prayer Book, the standard Siddur of Anglo Jewry, and one I might add, which I remember well because it was the standard issue for bar mitzvah boys of my generation, and I still have mine with the inscription in it. That's also been developed into a whole series of Koren Sachs Siddurim and Machzorim. Elkan made aliyah to Israel in 2011 and lives in Netanya. And by profession, Elkan was a solicitor in private practice for 30 years. In his spare time, he is keenly interested in history, Freemasonry and railways, on all of which he lectures. Railways, okay, we might have to get him back to talk about that. He believes passionately in the unity of the Jewish people and the religious imperative of speaking to all Jews on all levels of observance and none. Elkan, welcome to the AJA. It's wonderful to have you join us.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's a great and unexpected pleasure to be talking to you on the other side of the world. Here it's just lunchtime. Fortunately, I've never been to Australia, but one of my best friends is Rabbi Apple, who I fancy
Oh,
a number of you will know quite well.
yes, very, very famous name.
Let me go into share screen now. That should go there.
That's it. We're set to go.
We're set to go. Can I just begin by saying, first of all, thank you to the ambassador for that very nice and unexpected introduction. Thank you particularly to my beloved partner, Andy, who arranged that. I'm aware that Sunday is Anzac Day, and that a great deal of the fighting that conquered what is now the state of Israel from the Turks was done by the Australians, and they suffered as well quite heavy casualties. And the other thing that I think I would like to mention, although I'm not sure it's necessary for this particular audience, is the fact that although I use the term Palestine, I'm talking about Ottoman Palestine. I'm not talking about the two-state solution or anything that exists at the moment. The Balfour Declaration is one of the most important letters in history, but it's a very strange thing altogether. It's an extremely complex and very unlikely story. At the beginning of November 1914, the idea that a major power would issue a declaration supporting the relatively minor and unimportant Zionist movement was the dream of a few idealists. The idea that it would come from Britain, a country whose foreign office viewed Zionism as a German movement, which was then headquartered in Berlin, would have seemed totally impossible. The idea that a Jew born in the Haim with Yiddish as his mother tongue would come to mesmerize members of the British aristocracy who held important positions in government would have seemed laughable. And yet, after 3 years, this is exactly what happened. This is the Ottoman Empire as it stood in 1913. And they had only recently sort of lost Egypt, which was now to all intents and purposes a British possession, and they'd only recently lost Libya. By 1920, that's all that remained of it. But the Ottomans were not one unity. The Ottoman Empire actually consisted of three peoples. There were the Arabs, who were Muslims, there were the Turks, who were Muslims, and the Armenians, who were Christians. The figurehead of the empire was a sultan, but the truth is that it was ruled by three people: Talat Pasha, who was the Grand Vizier, Enver Pasha, who was the Minister of War, and Jamal Pasha, who was the Minister of the Navy, although in fact he was responsible for what was going on in Palestine, and from our point of view is very important if we were to be talking about the origins of the state of Israel. Although these three cooperated to begin with, they didn't like each other, they didn't trust each other, and this dislike became worse as the war continued. Now look at the British Empire. This is the extent of the British Empire in 1914. And you will see all over Canada, Africa, and particularly your end of the world, Australia, New Zealand, and India. And if you're going to go to this part of the world, then the real pressure point is here. It's the Suez Canal. Because otherwise you have to schlep all the way around through Cape Town. So the Middle East was becoming very, very important. And the Suez Canal was becoming extremely important. It was in effect run by the British, since Disraeli had bought the majority shareholding in it. But they were very concerned, A, that the Russians, that the Ottomans might attack it, B, that the French might come too close, and C, if you look at this long coastline here, this is Saudi Arabia now. It's Arabia, it's Ottoman. And the British were very concerned that if this part of the coastline came under the control of aggressive Ottomans, or even worse, under the control of Germans, then that would make the route to India very difficult. The Prime Minister at the beginning of the war was this man, Herbert Henry Asquith. He was a lawyer by profession. He was an extremely good peacetime Prime Minister. He brought in a lot of major social changes within Britain, but he was not a good Prime Minister during war. He was indecisive, and more to the point, on occasion, he nurtured an illicit passion for a young lady called Venetia Stanley. And we'll come back to her because that actually played a part in the Balfour Declaration as well. Cairo was under the control of this guy, Kitchener of Khartoum, K of K. He was an engineering officer whose first dealings actually with the land of Israel was when he surveyed the country between 1874 and 1877, and he produced what he called the Survey of Western Palestine. That is in use to this day as the basis for the grid system. If I pick up a Carter map of Tel Aviv and look for a particular street, and I'm told that it is on such and such a page, square Bet 3, that is following ultimately Kitchener's survey of Palestine. And the border between Israel and Lebanon to this day is at the point where his survey stopped. He got a great deal of fame in England because in 1898 he defeated a group of insane Muslims, not unlike Islamic State actually, at the Battle of Omdurman. One of the people who fought in that battle was a young man called Winston Churchill, who fought in the 21st Lancers, and he didn't like Kitchener. He described him as a vulgar common man. He was, however, very fluent in Arabic, and he actually once said that he preferred the company of his Egyptian friends to those of his British friends, which must have gone down a bundle. And in 1911, he went back to Egypt as the British agent and consul general, almost in effect the ruler. At the start of the First World War in August 1914, Kitchener, as it happens, was on leave in England. He started to go back to Cairo, and Asquith had him pulled off a cross-channel ferry, brought back to London, and made the Secretary of State for War with a seat in the cabinet. He was one of the few who foresaw that it would be a long war. It would last for at least 3 years. And he organized the largest volunteer army that Britain had ever seen. And he, of course, produced this very famous recruiting poster, "Your country needs you." He had a lot of faith in the Arab wish to rebel against the Ottoman rule. And he was also, as I say, very concerned about safety along this long coastline. This is incidentally still one of the most dangerous waterways in the world. A friend of mine was on a cruise a couple of years ago, and they went up this part of this Red Sea, and they were told that they were not to go on deck after dark in case of pirates. The guy who ruled this area was this man, Hussein bin Ali. He was the Sheriff and the Emir of Mecca. And when Turkey came into the war against Britain in November 1914, Britain made contact with Hussein, wanted to know his attitude. The Indian office were very concerned lest the Indian Muslims be persuaded to join in a jihad against Britain and France, because you have to remember that at this time, Britain was the largest Muslim power in the world. Let me repeat that. Britain was the largest Muslim power in the world. And there were a series of 10 letters exchanged between this man and Sir Henry McMahon. He was the man who succeeded who succeeded Kitchener as top man in High Commissioner in Egypt. And it has to be said that his staff did not regard him as being too bright. He had these letters with Hussein. Hussein, of course, didn't read English, and McMahon didn't read Arabic, so they were translated somewhat sloppily by this guy, Sir Ronald Storrs. His knowledge of the language was not as good as he thought. They were trying to persuade Hussein that after the war, if he organized a rebellion, then he would have an enormous kingdom over most of what was the Arab world. But it was actually very difficult to define anyway. This is a map of the Ottoman administrative divisions of Syria, Palestine, and these various areas, the Sanjak and the other areas, were just not very, very clear. But the result of this correspondence was the Arab revolt of 1916-1918, led by Hussein's sons, Faisal, who was a first-class general, but was very lazy and tended to arrive at wherever he had to be much too late to make a difference. And this man, Abdullah, who finished up as king of the Jordan and was assassinated in 1951 on the Temple Mount. And they were assisted by this man, Thomas Edward Lawrence of Arabia. He has a very interesting and curious background. Thomas Chapman was an Irish landowner who had a number of children, and he and his wife employed a young lady called Sarah Jana to be their governess, etc. And Thomas began to have an affair with Sarah, and Mrs. Chapman said, "It's either me or her." So he said, "Thank you, it's her." And Chapman and Sarah Jana moved to Oxford and lived together as Mr. and Mrs. Lawrence, although it appears they probably weren't married. They had 4 children, of whom Thomas Edward Lawrence was the oldest. And he was trained as an archaeologist, and he traveled in the Middle East quite a lot between 1910 and 1914. And probably in those days, as most archaeologists did a bit of spying for the Foreign Office. The most important thing he found out during that time was that the fortress of Aqaba on the Red Sea had very many heavy guns, but they were all pointed out to sea. None of them faced inland because the Turks did not believe that Aqaba could be attacked across the desert. The revolt, it has to be said, was not a spontaneous event. It was fed by large amounts of gold supplied by Britain. And Lawrence had no particular illusions about the Arabs. He said, "They are even less stable than the Turks. If properly handled, they would remain in a state of political mosaic, a tissue of small, jealous principalities incapable of cohesion." But he was quite right to be cynical also about the motives of the British, because at the same time as McMahon and Ali were corresponding, the correspondence was going on in London, negotiations between this guy, Sir Tatton Benvenuto Mark Sykes. Tragic figure. He died at 39 in the Spanish flu epidemic. Had he not, almost certainly he would have finished up as Prime Minister. His father, when he was a 48-year-old bachelor, had been tricked into marrying an 18-year-old and paying her debts. When he found out that she had heavy debts, he separated from her and put an advert in all the leading papers saying he would no longer be responsible for his wife's debts. They then separated, and Mark was brought up by his mother as a Roman Catholic, which proved to be very important for the Zionists. He was an effervescent personality. He bubbled with ideas. He swept up his listeners with enthusiasm. He was the Member of Parliament for Hull Central. He was a friend of Balfour. He was regarded as the British expert on Turkish affairs, and he designed a flag for the Arab revolt in a combination of green, red, black, and white. We know that flag because to this day, it is the color of the so-called Palestinian state. France had influence in Syria, and in those days under the Ottomans, Syria went all the way down to the Suez Canal, and the British were not very keen about that. So they told Sykes to negotiate with the French, and he negotiated with this guy, Francois-Georges Picot, who was a professional diplomat in the French embassy in London, who was a better diplomat and a better negotiator than Sykes. And by March 1916, they had hammered out what they called the Sykes-Picot Agreement. This was meant to be very secret, and it was until after the Bolshevik Revolution. This divided the Middle East into 4 areas. There was the blue zone, which was going to be ruled by France, which went all the way down the Eastern Mediterranean coast. There was the A zone, which was ruled by the Arabs, but it was under French influence. Similarly, the B zone was ruled by the Arabs under British influence. And then there was the red zone, which contained oil. It's Baghdad, Iraq, and so on. And for the first time, Palestine was regarded as a totally separate entity. That's very important for all sorts of reasons. It wasn't going to be subject to the French influence at all. The Prime Minister, Sykes and the Foreign Office began to feel they'd given away too much to France, which is why in the end they didn't particularly want to enforce a lot of this agreement. The Prime Minister at the time was this man, David Lloyd George, a Welshman, the Welsh wizard. He was a man who had had a huge biblical upbringing. It's said if you go into his house in Criccieth in North Wales, there are a number of plaques that deal with ideas that moved him. And in one of them, he said, "When I grew up, I had more knowledge of the kings of Judah and Israel than I did of the kings of Wales." His first encounter with Zionism actually was in 1906, when his legal firm, Lloyd George Roberts & Co., were professionally instructed to act for the Zionist movement into what we call the Uganda scheme. But he had a very strange moral character. Baldwin, a subsequent prime minister, once said that Lloyd George had a morally disintegrating effect on all he had to deal with. Asquith's daughter, Violet Bonham Carter, once said that although he never sold his soul, he frequently pawned it. And Kitchener said that he wouldn't give military secrets to the cabinet, as they would all go home and tell their wives, except for Lloyd George, who would go home and tell someone else's wife. One of the other leading figures of this time is this man, Arthur James Balfour. He was the nephew of Robert Salisbury, the Marquis of Salisbury, who was the last of Queen Victoria's prime ministers, and he succeeded his uncle, and it was felt that he'd got the job because he was Salisbury's nephew, not because he was any good. This actually led to the phrase in English use, and perhaps in Australia, "and Bob's your uncle." He was very laid back, and he has a number of quotations, but this is my favorite quotation by Balfour. "Why can't the Jews and the Arabs just sit down together and settle this like good Christian?" In 1906, there was a general election in England, in which, incidentally, Balfour not only lost the election, but as Prime Minister lost his own seat. He had been responsible, or had been part of this offer of the Uganda scheme to the Zionists. And a young scientist from Manchester University, who in those days was known as Dr. Charles Weitzman, went to see him, and he was told he could have 15 minutes with Balfour, and stayed for an hour and a half. And Balfour said to Weitzman he couldn't understand why the Zionists rejected the Uganda offer and continued to cling to Jerusalem. Weitzman said to him, Mr. Balfour, he said, supposing I was to offer you Paris instead of London, would you take it? But Dr. Weitzman, Balfour replied, we have London. To which Weitzman rejoined, that is true, but we had Jerusalem when London was a marsh. Balfour said, are there many Jews who think like you? I speak the mind of millions of Jews. Curious. The Jews I meet are quite different. Ah, Mr. Balfour, said Weitzman, you meet the wrong kind of Jews. A lot of the lot of Anglo Jews were anti-Zionists because they were afraid that after 2.5 centuries of persuading the British that they were good card-carrying Englishmen, they would suffer considerably if they then started to be Zionists, and they might have to go to Palestine. But one of the leading members of the community was this man, Herbert Samuel. I have to tell you, Herbert Samuel is a particular hero of mine because I knew him. I have a bar mitzvah present from him. He was a member of the New West End Synagogue in London all his life. He was bar mitzvah there, he was married there, his funeral took place there. And my father was the chazan of that synagogue from 1946 till 1984. So I actually knew Herbert Samuel. He was a very much an English Jew, observant to a certain extent. And he was a cabinet minister at the beginning of the First World War. And he had become a Zionist, possibly because his wife, Beatrice Samuel, whom I also remember, was friends with somebody called Mrs. Gaster. We'll come back to her husband later. And when Turkey came into the war on the side of Germany in October 1914, it suddenly made Zionism a subject of considerable interest to Her Majesty's government. Unknown to anybody in the movement, Samuel had become a Zionist. And as I say, Britain was concerned because of the Suez Canal. So right at the beginning, Samuel went to talk to Sir Edward Grey, the Foreign Secretary, who was in favor of the idea of a Jewish settlement in Palestine. And later he also discussed the matter with Lloyd George. And this was suddenly important because this was cabinet minister to cabinet minister. And in 1915, he submitted a memorandum suggesting that Palestine become a home for the Jewish people as a British war aim. It received a lukewarm reception, but it was eventually the seed that led to the Balfour Declaration. One of the other people with whom he worked was this man, C.P. Scott, a Manchester Methodist, I think he was. He was a member of parliament for one of the Manchester constituencies, a Liberal member of parliament, so he was a friend of Lloyd George, and he was the owner and editor of the Manchester Guardian, which in those days was very much a Liberal paper. He became a friend of Chaim Weitzman, and he had a remarkable friendship with him because Weitzman's intellectual brilliance was attracting the attention of Tory press and senior ministers. And he also persuaded Chaim Weitzman to meet Herbert Samuel, whom Weitzman thought would be a waste of time. Weitzman went to see Samuel, who was a rather dour character, and spoke to him for 20 minutes about Zionism, expecting to get a non-committal answer. And to his amazement, Samuel said to him, "You're not asking for enough. You don't need to ask for a Jewish settlement in Palestine under the protection of the great powers. You need to ask for an independent state in Palestine. It means you'll have to set up tax system, you'll have to build roads, you'll have to build railways, but you should have your own state." He had come to Manchester University in 1904. In 1910, he became a British citizen, which for him was very, very precious. And by accident, in about 1912, in his laboratory, he discovered a method of producing acetone by a different process than the process that was used at the time. And in 1915, this became very important. In 1915, there was a big battle in Neuve-Chapelle in France. The British Army didn't have enough shells, and those that they had often didn't go off. And the reason was that there was a major shortage of an explosive called cordite. And one of the major ingredients in the process of producing cordite was acetone. Lloyd George, who was the Minister of Munitions, sent for Chaim Weizmann when he found out that Weizmann had this patent to do with acetone, and said to him, "Can you manufacture 30,000 tons of acetone for us this year using your method?" And Weizmann said, "I've got no idea. I've only ever produced a few cc's in a test tube in the laboratory." So they eventually loaned him the Nicholson gin fat distillery in London, because it was a question of distillation, and he found out that he could produce the required amount of acetone, and he was regarded as being one of the people who had actually saved the British Army in 1915-16. And more to that, it brought him into contact with all sorts of important leaders in British society. This is a picture of Vera and Chaim Weizmann with Herbert Samuel, David Lloyd George, and the Snowdens, he was Chancellor of the Exchequer. This man is very important. Nachum Sokolov was the Secretary General of the World Congress. He was a diplomatist, he was a journalist. He had actually converted the French Foreign Office to Zionism. And then Mark Sykes had said to him in 1917, 1917, we think you should go on to Rome, because remember, Italy was on the side of Britain and France in the First War. We think you should go on to Rome and meet a man called, anyway, to meet the Foreign Secretary, Pacelli, who afterwards became Pope Pius XII. And Pacelli said to him, you should go and meet the Pope. So he, having a couple of years earlier found it difficult to talk to anybody, he found himself in an audience with Benedict XV, who was supportive of Zionism, provided that the Zionists do not take the Christian holy places. And then on his way back to France, way back through France, the French Foreign Office at the Quai d'Orsay asked him to come in, and the French issued a sort of letter of support for Zionism, which was not as specific as the Balfour Declaration, but actually predates it by a number of months. Among the other leaders in England was this guy, Chacham Moses Gaster. He was a Romanian Ashkenazi scholar who, for some reason, Sephardim appointed in a great hurry as their Chacham, their chief rabbi, and then they lived to regret it for about 30 years. And in the end, they sort of sacked him in December 1918. You don't often sack a chief rabbi. But he was one of the leaders of the Zionist movement. But Zionism was not straightforward, and there were certain people who had to be defeated. And one of them was this man. Lucien Wolf was a very well-known and highly respected journalist. He wrote in all the quality papers on diplomatic matters. He was very concerned about the status of Jews in the Russian Empire. In London, the Russians regarded him as public enemy #1 because he kept on pushing against them. But then when in 1917, there was the Kerensky Revolution and the Russian Jews suddenly had all the civic rights that they could possibly want, his purpose in life to a certain extent, or purpose in negotiation with the Foreign Office, failed. And somebody in the Foreign Office said, thank God we don't have to deal with Mr. Wolf anymore. That's a note on a memorandum somewhere. But he was very anti-Zionist. He did not believe that Palestine should be a Jewish state. And he had a lot of contacts with the Foreign Office. And they knew that there was a row going on, and they knew, Foreign Office knew that Sokolov was saying that in principle, both the British and French governments are pro-Zionist, which was true. And Lucien Wolf was warned by Lord David Cecil in the Foreign Office, don't have a row with the Zionists in public. it won't help at all. It will embarrass the Foreign Office and it will do your cause no good. And despite this, that is exactly what Lucian Wolff did. The Anglo-Jewish community was, some of it was run by two organizations, the Anglo-Jewish Association, commonly known as the AJA, I'm afraid. It doesn't stand in England for the Australian Jewish Association. He was a considerable scholar, but he was a very, very left-wing. He was one of the people who founded the liberal movement, religious movement in England. Highly intellectual, used to give sermons and believed that if you had anything to say in a sermon, if it was less than 45 minutes long, it wasn't worth delivering. And the AJA joined with the Board of Deputies, which is the sort of British Parliament, still is. And their president was this man, David Lindo Alexander KC. And they decided to issue a public statement of their position as anti-Zionists. Emancipated Jews in this country, they said, regard themselves primarily as a religious community. They hammered the Zionist theory, which regards all Jewish communities of the world as constituting one homeless nationality. They do not feel that the Jews who settled in Palestine should have any rights or privileges. Had they issued this letter in the Jewish Chronicle, it might have been all right, but they didn't. They issued it in the Times, where it duly appeared on the 24th of May, 1917, and it produced a whole number of letters in refutation, one from Weitzman, one from Walter, the second Lord Rothschild, particularly from this man, Chief Rabbi Joseph Herman Hertz, who was a very strong Zionist. Hertz had only been appointed in 1913, but he was prepared to take on the most important leaders of the community. And he wrote a letter to the Times saying, as Chief Rabbi of the United Hebrew Congregations of the British Empire, I cannot allow your readers to remain under the misconception that the statement represents in the least the views held by Anglo Jewry as a whole or by the juries of the overseas dominions. It is indeed grievously painful to me to write this in your influential columns, but I am impelled to do so in the interests of truth and in justice to the communities of which I have the honor and privilege of being the spiritual head. There was a huge row within the community, and David Alexander, the president of the Board of Deputies, had to resign over it. Lucian Wolff had lost all his influence, but the road was not clear for the declaration because there was one more serious opponent to be faced, this man. Edwin Samuel Montagu was a British liberal politician. The seventh child of Samuel Montagu was first Baron Swathling. He was actually the first cousin of Herbert Samuel. And when his father died in 1911, his father left him £1 million at 1911 money, provided that he married Jewish. The trouble is that he'd fallen in love with this lady, Venetia Stanley, the daughter of the Earl of Sheffield, who was a very young lady. And the problem was the following. In about 1912 or 1913, Asquith had said to his daughter, let's go on holiday to the Mediterranean. You bring one of your friends and I'll bring one of my young proteges. So Violet Asquith took Venetia and Herbert took Edwin Montagu. And the trouble is that both Herbert Asquith and Edwin Montagu both fell in love with this lady. And during the early years of the First World War, at some stages in boring cabinet minister meetings, Asquith would sit on one side of the cabinet table writing highly improper letters to Venetia Stanley, with whom he hoped to have an affair. It's not impossible that he actually did. And what was worse, telling her all sorts of highly secret matters which he had no right to disclose to her, while on the other side of the table, Edwin Montagu was writing letters to Venetia Stanley asking her to marry him. In the end, after negotiations between Venetia and Edwin which I am told included such matters as how often he was to have her conjugal rights and how many affairs she could have outside marriage. She agreed in April 1915 to convert to Judaism. She did her conversion between then and the 26th of July 1915, and then had a form of chuppah in his brother's drawing room, after which she had nothing to do with the Judaism or the community, and it was known in the Jewish community as Edwin Montagu's Venetian blind. Montagu was violently opposed to Zionism, which actually bemused his cabinet colleagues, because after Lloyd George became prime minister, Herbert Samuel wouldn't join the cabinet, and Edwin in the end did. And he even wrote a memo to his colleagues entitled The Anti-Semitism of the Present Government, in which he said, "I assert there is not a Jewish nation. I deny that Palestine is today associated with the Jews or properly to be regarded as a fit place for them to live in. When the Jew has a national home, surely it follows that the impetus to deprive him of British citizenship must be enormously increased. Palestine will become the world's ghetto. And finally, the government are asked to be the instrument of a Zionist organization, largely run by men of enemy descent or birth." He wasn't a member of the war cabinet that was dealing with the Balfour Declaration, but he was invited to the meetings, and his fervor led to two clauses being put in the draft. One was it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine. And the second was, or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country. The second clause is innocuous. The first clause about prejudicing civil and religious rights of non-Jewish communities was the reason that the British government in the 1930s closed the gates of Palestine to the Jews who were trying to get there to escape the Holocaust. Luckily, Edwin Montagu must have been very brilliant, because at the age of 39, he had been appointed the Secretary of State for India, which was one of the top jobs in the British cabinet. And on the 18th of October 1917, he left for India for an extended fact-finding tour. And actually, in the end, he produced a paper which led to Indian independence. There were very strong supporters of Zionism in the Foreign Office, foremost among this Lord Robert Cecil, who was Balfour's cousin, who had been converted to Zionism by Weitzman. He once said, "We are all Weitzmanites in this house." And Weitzman had at various times suggested the following reasons to the Foreign Office that they should issue a declaration in support of Zionism. First of all, imperial concerns. A strong Jewish homeland in Palestine, which would be pro-British, would protect the north flank of Egypt, including the Suez Canal. If the French finished up in Syria, Palestine would act as a buffer between France and the canal. Then there was this old canal that the Jews rule the world, and particularly the Jews rule Washington. And he said to the Foreign Office that Zionism would be attractive to the Jews who had enormous power in Washington. British support for Zionism would therefore counter German influence in Washington. You have to remember that major financiers in Washington, such as Jacob Schiff, were not only Jewish, but also German. And therefore a pro-Zionist declaration would persuade them as Jews to support America's war effort. Then Zionism would appeal very strongly to the hearts of Russian Jews. It would hopefully lead the Jews to press the Kerensky government to stay in the war. Britain was terrified that the Russians would make a separate peace with the Germans, and that this would release hundreds of thousands of highly trained German troops to come from the Eastern Front to the Western Front and to attack the British before the Americans really came on stream. And that is exactly what happened on the 21st of March 1918. The Germans using the troops that they brought from Russia, attacked the British and nearly won the war. And they also persuaded the Foreign Office that Britain needed to issue a statement quickly, since Weizmann had persuaded the government that the Germans were about to issue a pro-Zionist statement. It's actually quite an amazing thing that they should issue a pro-Zionist statement which would go against the Ottomans, who were their own allies. But the Foreign Office bought it. And eventually the War Cabinet met on the 31st of October, and they approved the text that Balfour produced. And Sir Mark Sykes rushed out and said to Dr. Weizmann, he said, "It's a boy." The letter was addressed to this man, Walter II Lord Rothschild, who was president of the English Zionist Federation. He was banned from the bank because he was no good as a financier, but he was very interested in animals, and he used to drive around London in a coach pulled by 4 zebras. And it was to him that the Balfour Declaration was addressed. Dear Lord Rothschild, I have much pleasure in conveying to you on behalf of His Majesty's government the following declaration of sympathy with Jewish Zionist aspirations, which has been submitted to and approved by the Cabinet. His Majesty's government view with favour the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavours to facilitate the achievement of this object, it being clearly understood, etc. I should be grateful if you would bring this declaration to the knowledge of the Zionist Federation. Yours sincerely, Arthur James Balfour. It is, as has been said, one of the most important letters in history. What's also interesting is this, that although it's dated November the 2nd, it was embargoed until Friday, November the 9th, so that it could appear for the first time in the London Jewish Chronicle. After the war, what happened? Mark Sykes died in Paris in 1919 in the Spanish flu epidemic. Interestingly, he was exhumed in 2008, since he'd been buried in a lead-lined coffin, and virologists thought he might have preserved some of the DNA of the Spanish flu virus. So Ronald Storrs became the governor of Jerusalem and said that he was the first governor of Jerusalem since Pontius Pilate. He was a very keen chess player, and he set up the Palestine International Chess Club. I love this picture. Edwin Montagu spent time in India and eventually became very obstreperous. Lloyd George forced him to resign in 1922, and he died in 1924, aged 45, a disappointed and embittered man. Hussein bin Ali remained king of Arabia until the Ibn Saud family overthrew him in 1923 and renamed this territory Saudi Arabia. Faisal became king of Iraq and died in 1933, possibly as a result of arsenic poisoning. His brother Abdullah was appointed king of Jordan when Winston Churchill separated the territories of the Palestine Mandate, which had originally included what is now Jordan, and created what he called the Hashemite Kingdom of Transjordan. Abdullah was assassinated at the Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem in July 1951 because he was developing relations with Israel. King Abdullah II of Jordan is his great-grandson. Lloyd George remained prime minister until 1922, but never held office after that, and the Liberal Party was wiped out at the election in 1924. When his wife died in 1941, he married his long-term mistress, Frances Stevenson. He remained an MP until February 1945, when he was created an Earl, but he died 6 weeks later. Chaim Weizmann went on to be the High Commissioner in Palestine, leader of who once said, and I've heard him say that, he said, "I was the first Jewish ruler of Palestine for 2,000 years. He said, "My immediate predecessor was Herod." He was the leader of the Liberal Party, he was a member of the House of Lords, and he was one of the speakers at my bar mitzvah lunch. Chaim Weizmann became the unquestioned leader of the Zionist movement and the first president of Israel. Balfour remained a strong supporter of Zionism. He came to the Holy Land with Allenby in 1925 for the inauguration of the Hebrew University, when he made an emotional speech. This is a picture of the inauguration. There's Hertz and canonicals, there's Weitzman, there's Herbert Samuel, there's Allenby in a top hat and a British greatcoat, there's Rav Cook, and there's Balfour. So let's leave Balfour with the last word. In 1918, he said the following. He said, "Conversations I held with Dr. Weitzman in January 1906 convinced me that if a home is to be found for the Jewish people, it is vain to seek it anywhere but in Palestine. The position of the Jews is unique. For them, race, religion, and country are interrelated, as they are interrelated in the case of no other race, no other religion, and no other country on earth. Zionism will mitigate the lot and elevate the status of the Jewish race. It will do great spiritual and material work for the Jews, but not for them alone." Ladies and gentlemen, Dinat Yisrael exists significantly because of the 125 words of the Balfour Declaration. As Theresa May, who was Prime Minister of Britain at the time of the centenary, said, "It is truly one of the most important letters in history." Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for listening to me.
Thank you. Now we'll just go off screen sharing. Let's take the screen sharing away. That's it. Elkan, that's a fascinating story. It's the twists and the turns and the people. It's like a soap opera, really. Now we are coming up to time. We've got a few people with their hands up. I'm not sure how many we'll get through, but Ron, you had your first hand up, so your hand up first. So please unmute yourself and ask your question.
Okay, I'm going to change my original question, but thank you for a very fascinating presentation. Thank you so much. What was the interaction between Einstein and Weitzman? You just mentioned the Hebrew University, and Einstein was very much involved with that as well, I understand. And how were they both involved in supporting with each other with the Zionist movement of the time?
Einstein was undoubtedly pro-Zionist, and indeed he was offered the presidency of Israel after Weitzman died. Einstein was very much in favor of the Hebrew University, but the Hebrew University was very much Weitzman's pet project, because he believed that this would set the seal on the development of Jewish settlement. And if you remember, actually, he bought the land on which the Hebrew University now stands on Mount Scopus was purchased from the Grey Hills when it was still occupied by the Ottomans. He was that certain that they would win, and that would be where the university would be. And the 12 foundation stones of the university were set in 1918, long before the war ended. And Einstein was a very big supporter of it. And of course, Einstein, after he died, left all his papers to the Hebrew University.
Okay, look, I think we can only take one more question because we want to hear from Andy. Michael, you are next in line, so please unmute yourself and ask your question.
Yeah, look, I'd just like to know what you think if the vote at the United Nations that established the State of Israel, if that was to be done today, the same countries that voted for it, against it, what do you think the outcome would be?
I don't think there can be any real doubt about that. The problem with the United Nations is that each nation has one vote, and therefore there is an inbuilt anti-Israel vote in it. There is a lecture that was given by the great Rabbi J.B. Soloveitchik on the origins of the State of Israel, and the fact that he said there were 6 times when God interfered to make the State of Israel possible. And the first one was that he said, who would have thought that in 1947, the Americans and the Russians would have voted together on the same side, apart from all the other nations. He said, this was undoubtedly God's doing in the United Nations, and the truth is they've done nothing worthwhile since. And I think that's probably true.
Okay, thanks. Look, we'll squeeze one more question in. Anthony was next. Anthony, please unmute yourself. Then we're going to go to hear from Andy.
Yes, on that issue, by law, the Balfour Declaration was brought into legality from the League of Nations. By definition, the United Nations took over all the agreements of the League of Nations. So, in effect, the law of the League of Nations should still stand even above the, in legal terms, the United Nations Declaration. In current circumstances, which do you think has the strongest pull?
I think it's gone beyond legalities. I think you need to look at the reality. We've got 9 million people living in this amazing state. The Palestinians, in Abba Eban's brilliant phrase, have never missed an opportunity to miss an opportunity. I think that the legal title of the state of Israel to its land is unchallengeable. Just as, I mean, without any doubt, just as, for instance, this nonsense about the West Bank is occupied territory. It isn't occupied territory because it never belonged to anybody. It never belonged to Jordan. And the Palestinian state that was envisaged in the various United Nations declarations, including November 47, has never come to pass. So the truth is that the West Bank is completely unowned by anybody. The only people who even recognize that there might be a Palestine state there, curiously enough, are the Israelis under the Oslo Accords. But one can argue legalities from Heint bis morgen, as they say. The truth is that the reality is what's there. And we're very conscious of it. We're conscious of what we go through in Israel. We are conscious of the security risks that we take. My oldest grandchild, my granddaughter Jasmine, is currently serving in the Israeli army, and I cannot even begin to tell you how proud I am every time I see a photograph of her in her uniform. I know that my other grandchildren will in due course serve. So has my son-in-law, so has my son. That's the reality. But the truth is we have the most amazing and incredible state here. Look at the way in which Israel has come out of COVID and has vaccinated people faster than anybody else. Look at the amazing developments that we've got. Look at the intellectual ferment that comes from here. Look at the way that every time you pick up a laptop, and everybody uses laptops these days, every time you pick up a laptop, you are using Israeli technology. It goes to every aspect of life in the world in the 21st century. The truth is that as Jews, we may not have huge natural resources. We haven't got coal, we haven't got steel, we may or may not have oil, we have got a certain amount of gas, but the truth is that our major natural resource is the Yiddish kop. It's our brains, because we had to develop brains in order to survive. And that's what's enabled us to get where we are. I cannot tell you that I must tell you that one of the very proudest possessions that I have is my Israeli passport. I am proud to be a citizen of this state.
Thank you, Elkan. It's very powerful words, and I think we could probably go on for another hour, but we can't. Just before we go, if anybody ever had any doubts that the Jewish world is one big family, I want to welcome Andy Goldman, who is Elkan's partner, and she also has an interesting story to tell, as she volunteers with an organisation that welcomes English-speaking Olim to Netanya. So Andy, just for a couple of minutes, would you like to tell us a little of what you do?
Thank you very much. I I like to say Israel is my over the rainbow where dreams you dare to dream do come true. Never did I think I would be speaking as an American to a group of Australians. I've helped Olim to move to Israel for the last 10 years. I've been doing with Nevish B'Nevish and also on Facebook. But what I want to tell you a little bit about is living in Israel. I actually see and experience events that are often lies in the international media, and sometimes not even spoken about the media. Israel is a home that is made of Jews, Bedouins, Druze, and Arabs. May 16th will be my 15th anniversary of making aliyah. And Israel is really a country full of history and opportunities. We've walked on the street in Jerusalem where Allenby walked in 1917. We laid a wreath on Anzac Day in Jerusalem. Here as an American, I laid a wreath. We've attended the Battle of Beersheba ceremony in the Australian Park in Beersheba. And it was beautiful to hear the Australian national anthem, the Israeli national anthem, and even the Turkish national anthem, because right near where the ceremony is held in the morning is the Turkish statue where they have a memorial for the Turkish. I've even spoken to the current Lord Balfour, believe it or not, at the annual Balfour dinner that is put on by IPCA, the Israel, British and Commonwealth Association, where we actually do dress up. Next month, we will be attending the tea at the residence of the Australian ambassador. Israel has been ranked as the 11th happiest country in the world, followed by Australia, which is 12. You don't need to speak Hebrew, but you need a positive attitude. And Israel is different from Australia, like America is different from Israel. But if you're thinking of making aliyah, you're very lucky to help Telfed, because they now help Australians make a safe landing in Israel, and having a safe landing is important. They answer questions regarding pre-aliyah, and they're there for you after you move. In fact, in Netanya, Telfed has a representative that helps you. If you check out their website, they have information about employment, housing, banking, healthcare, and important concerns about moving to a new country. And I hope one day to either see and meet you in Australia, or maybe you'll come to Israel. Thank you for giving me this opportunity.
Thanks, Andy. It certainly will be in Israel. All we need is for COVID to settle down and our borders to be open, because there's a lot of us, I'm sure, on this session tonight who would have been in Israel at some point over the last 12 months. Elkan and Andy, thank you again so much for the presentations. Fascinating story, and it's just been so interesting to hear the history of it also. So we want to thank you for joining us and virtually visiting us in Australia. And we look forward to seeing you here if you ever can get here. But we'd love to see you. So we've just gone a few minutes over time. I'll quickly hand back to David just for the final wrap up. And look, one more thing. I'm sorry to those who have got their hands up and we couldn't get to questions, but Elkan's presentation was so interesting. We just had to hear the whole thing. So apologies to you, those people. Okay, back to you, David.
Okay, well, look, thank you very much, Elkan. It was a very, very informative presentation, and I suspect this is a video that'll be useful in the archive. I just want to show one quote, seeing the matter of the UN came up, and I think it really summarises it very well. The Israeli ambassador to the UN, Abu Eben, was the one who said that if Algeria introduced a resolution declaring that the earth was flat and that Israel had flattened it, it would pass by a vote of 164 to 13 with 26 abstentions. And not much has changed since that was made, I think, around 1960. So that's probably a fair summary of the UN's attitude. And finally, as we always do, we need the support of everyone here. If you haven't yet joined our email list, you go to the website jewishassociation.org.au and you can sign up for free to get our information and be notified of future events like this. Liking and following the Facebook page is the best way to get the news and views on a regular basis. And we do need tangible support. If you're not yet a member, also go to the website and join or make a donation in some way. Next week, we're actually going to have a well-earned break, as they say, but we have a whole program of very interesting people booked for May, and you'll hear and receive more information about that in the next week or two. Okay, back to you.
Thanks, David. Elkan and Andy, again, thank you so much. It's been wonderful to have your company. Thanks to everybody that joined, and we won't see you next week. We're just going to have a bit of a break, but we look forward to catching up with everybody in 2 weeks' time. And until then, I wish you all a very good evening. So good night to you all.